So thank you for coming today. My name is Aileen. I'm a member of the Political Theory Student Research Committee. And I have a BA in Political Science and International Relations and a Master's on Modern East Asian Studies. And today I will present to you part of my master thesis that is titled Nation Branding, National Identity and the Role of the Media, a case study on the Republic of Korea during the first 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic. Quickly through the table of contents, we will do a short introduction on the topic, followed by the hypothesis and the research questions. Then we will review the methodology that I followed throughout this research, along with some sample literature. And then the theory of nation branding and the theory of the collective self. Following that will be the frame construction and how the media influences that, and the media framing of the pandemic in South Korea. And lastly, we will go over the results of this research and the discussion of the results alongside the limitations. And finally, I will point a few articles that I found interesting through the bibliography, and hopefully we'll go through a Q&A. So to start with, countries are becoming more and more interested in how they look and how they're viewed by the external audiences. And therefore, there is an increase in how much they are willing to spend and invest towards their image. For South Korea, these efforts got their current form in 2009 under the In Young-pak administration. And when you read articles on Korea, you come across a lot of what I like to call cliché phrases at this point, such as the miracle of the Han River, or from recipient of aid to donor of aid. And all of these quotes highlight the difference between Korea in the 60s and 70s and Korea today. And even though we all know that Korea is quite strong nowadays in terms of economy, and Korean culture has become very, very popular, research shows that the achievements and the progress of the country are not always reflected on foreign audiences, and that for many people, Korea is still associated with poverty and with devastation because of the Korean War. So the question that I get from all of this is, how do Korean people feel about their own country's image, and how have the media influenced this image? So this study is an analysis of the theories of nation branding, especially on its internalized aspect, media framing and self-perception on a national level. And it aims to gather all those elements and theories and explore the potential adaptation to the internalized aspect of the South Korean nation brand, and hopefully be implemented on any other nation brand. So the hypothesis for this is that during the first months of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, the English language South Korean media published more articles that depicted the country in a favorable way than articles that depicted the country negatively, to present a positive image to the South Korean public and raise the collective self-esteem of the society. And to do that, I formulated certain research questions, such as what is the current perception of the collective self in South Korea? How does media framing affect the national collective self-esteem? Why would the news outlets prioritize articles with positive content? And how many positive and negative sentiment articles related to COVID-19 were published between January 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2020 by the examined outlets? Now, a small footnote here, I believe that the first article on COVID was published in January 20th, 2020, but I wasn't exactly sure, and it would seem kind of arbitrary to introduce that date, so I chose to include it from the first of the month. The methodology that I followed is a mixed approach. First, there are the qualitative elements, such as text and content analysis, the usual books, journals, newspaper articles, as well as various case studies of nation branding campaigns to create a theoretical foundation. Then, on my favorite, the quantitative methods, I ran a sentiment analysis using Vader, which is the Valence-aware dictionary for sentiment reasoning. It's a Python 3 library. So Vader calculates sentiments based on a specific framework, and it includes a pre-existing dictionary that has a predetermined score assigned to each word. So the closer to +1 the word is, the more positive its meaning, and the closer to -1, the more negative it is. It can also tell the difference between phrases such as not good and not so good, which is great when you're trying to run a sentiment analysis. And the media I selected were the Korea Herald and the Korea Tungang Daily. So the Korea Herald, according to their website, the Korea Herald is the nation's largest English language daily with a market share of more than 50%, as well as the only daily in South Korea that's a member of the Asian News Network. It is self-characterized as the face of Korean media, and it belongs to a corporation that is active in organizing fora regarding South Korea's business and finance sectors. It also has over 400,000 subscribers on Naver News, an online space that's mainly used by South Koreans. And on the website of the newspaper, in the About Us section, it states that it's the preferred source for English language news consumption by South Koreans, not just by foreigners. The Korea Tungang Daily has been named the official newspaper for major international events in Korea, such as the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics in 2018 and the FINA World Aquatic Championship in 2019, and can also be found on Naver News. If I'm not mistaken, the Tungang Daily is also the publishing partner of the New York Times in South Korea. And what is really interesting is that both dailies are available on newsstands in the streets of Seoul, like you walk the streets in Korea and you find random English language newspapers. So to me, that means that they want to be consumed by South Koreans as well, not just by foreigners. Now, on the literature, to try to establish the foundation for the study, you know, when we think of South Korea, we think of a bunch of different things, from like famous electronic brands that we're not sponsored by, so we're not going to say the names, to foods, to aesthetics, to all things K, like K-drama, K-pop, K-this, K-that. And this did not just happen overnight. It was actually really carefully planned and executed as a result of government and private efforts. And as what is usually being promoted in whatever this K entails is part of the culture of the society, people are quite particular about it, and they want to see it represented right. So when you use something related to Korean culture on a K-drama, this has actually been taken as it is in the society. It's not constructed just for you to see it in the drama. So according to Kim and other scholars, there are always elements of cultural nationalism in all of these K products, even in the way that idols are expected to act. Idols are all of the singers and the actors and actresses and all of these people. So for example, when they represent Korea, they must always have a good image because, of course, they are the face of the country abroad, but they must prioritize the national sentiment over their career. Otherwise, they do upset the people, and the idols face a lot of criticism. And if I'm not mistaken, there was this instance of an idol that was doing an interview in Japan, and the girl was asked something about the territorial disputes between Japan and Korea, and she gave a very diplomatic answer. And the people in Korea were very upset with her because she's still representing the country. On the topic of COVID, there's not much of a difference. There is a lot of literature with terms such as health diplomacy and pandemic diplomacy, and even K, quarantine again. So there is this very interesting study by Lee and Kim, and they wanted to see how the image of Korea has changed during the pandemic. So they examined a little bit more than 8,300 article headlines between January and June 2020. And they were all foreign language newspapers. 96% of them showed a positive sentiment. Therefore, the conclusion of Lee and Kim was that the image of the country had improved. Now, within South Korea, there is this collection of essays on Korea's public diplomacy, possibilities, and future outlooks. And it focuses on how South Korea gave aid to other countries and how fast the government responded and all of these nice, crazy things. But the problem is that the authors are not Korean. But the whole thing, like the publication was funded and published by the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Therefore, I would personally expect some bias when a government praises itself. But then again, it's free to access, so do feel free to study it and judge for yourselves. Now for the elephant in the room, the theory of nation branding. The original idea was presented by Simon Anholt in 1996, who said that all nations and countries, whether they like it or not, And whether they agree or not, they have a brand, just like products. This brand exists, and it's in the best interest of all nations to work towards improving the brand so that they can increase their influence and acquire financial gains. And for many researchers, the government is the only actor responsible for nation branding. And you might say that, okay, what's the difference with public diplomacy? There is no such difference. That's exactly the same thing. But well, it isn't, because it's not just the government that forms the brand, it's literally every single person. So there is this article by Fan, and it builds on Brown's past research, but essentially it has gathered like 6 central viewpoints of organization for a successful nation brand. And first, we need to consider how a nation understands itself, how it understands the world around it, how it thinks it is understood, how it's actually understood, how it promotes itself, and how it wishes to be seen. And talking about how a nation does this and how a nation does that, it requires looking within the nation, not just considering the opinion of marketing and PR experts who might come from other countries and be unfamiliar with the national sentiment. And research and results have shown that when the government just hires branding experts, usually the nation branding campaign is not supported by the people, and it doesn't align with the concept of internalizing the brand or living the brand. So for the campaign to be successful, it must be as close as what the people think is real to them, is real to their identity. And when governments create their branding strategies, they do include certain elements, obvious or not so obvious, which show that the nation branding targets their own citizens as well. For example, the government of Finland had written that one of the goals of their branding campaign was to raise the national esteem of the Finns. On Estonia and Germany, in other researches, it concluded that a waning nation brand can negatively affect societal bonds, thus leading to erosion of political procedures and foundations. And on China, the nation branding campaigns have also been used for nation building. And finally, in Greece, which is my personal favorite, we have this research by Yiannopoulos and Avlonitis, who did a series of interviews with people working in the tourism industry. And one of them said, we sell something more than accommodation, we sell part of the whole destination. Branding our country is our own affair. And I find it interesting how people believe they need to partake in creating an image for the country and how they essentially get to create the brand. And this is the only text, if I remember correctly, that a person other than a PR expert or a government official says that they get to participate in creating a brand for the country. To structure this research better, I used some of the elements of the central viewpoints of organization, how people perceive the country in their society, how they think they're being perceived, how they're actually perceived, how they want to be seen. And for this research to have a point, I added one of my own thoughts. Why does it matter to us how we are seen by the rest of the world? Because I believe it's important to know our motivations behind wanting to appear in a certain way, both as a person and as a nation. And since national identity is formed by common links and a common understanding of the collective self, which is necessary for a nation to survive and stay united and function, it's really interesting to see how nationalism and national identity evolves. So for South Korea, according to the research that I did, of course, South Korean culture, like any other culture, has changed drastically over the last few years, and there are massive, obvious generational differences, because there are people with memories of the Korean War alive, which was between 1950 and 1953. It wasn't that far back. And there are people born after Korea became a rich and developed nation. So, of course, the type of nationalism and understanding of the nation among the generations is very different. And this is why there is a lot of literature on how nationalism is formed and experienced in Korea. There are a lot of phrases like cultural nationalism, modern nationalism, and all of these distinctions that people try to do. And essentially, I believe that they derive from those changes between the generational changes and the wealth of the country, and from how nowadays young Koreans experience the country as an affluent cultural center. I read this book. It's called Korea's Place in the Sun. It's by Bruce Cummings. And at some point, he says that Korea has been for a long time a shrimp among whales, which comes from the Korean expression, in a fight between whales, the shrimp's back gets broken. And this proverb has been used to show Korea's position in East Asia, kind of surrounded by great powers all the time, despite its own achievements and efforts. And at the same time, studies show higher nationalistic sentiments from other Asian countries, such as Taiwan and Japan. So we can kind of see that people believe their country deserves better, and they're actively trying to achieve these better. So what is exactly the opinion of the other? What is happening here? In the first figure that's taken for brand directory, we see that Korea has managed to climb up. It's 2021, the 2021 list that came out like a month ago. Korea climbed up from 24 to 19, so that's a significant increase. But in Ipsos, it's still stuck in 23, like it was last year, despite all of these praise from the foreign media. And in the soft power index, it did increase from 14 to 11, but for a soft power, it's still stuck at 11. So there's not much of a difference between how Koreans think their country is viewed and how the country is actually viewed. It's like kind of stuck in the middle. And it's important to clarify that Korea has been pursuing this middle power policy. It needs to be capable of defending itself because of its position and the whole geopolitical thing that is happening. But it doesn't want to appear threatening the area. Nevertheless, even on the last index that shows that global soft power, number 11 is definitely not the ideal place, and definitely not as high as what the country hopes to achieve, especially after trying so actively for so many years. So why does it matter, not just to South Korea, but to everyone, how their country is viewed? I read this article, this research by Browning, I think Christopher Browning, and it might be the most enlightening thing I've ever read in my life regarding national identity and nationalism. The focus is on what he calls the ontological security of the nation, essentially the security of being or of existing. And it's what allows the nation to exist as a unit. And of course, it's linked to the nation's self-esteem. So naturally, as we can understand, individual identity and national identity are linked because one is part of the other, like both are part of the other. Therefore, what is, as we established before, what is being promoted must be as close as possible to what people feel to be true about their nation, so that it will have the people's support. So Browning explains that there is a need for a self-narrative that combines positive self-esteem, but it also creates a favorable image to the foreign audiences. Now, according to research, individuals are inclined to assess themselves positively, and at the same time, the individual's personal identity is rooted in the collective identity. Therefore, individuals tend to assess the group they belong to positively, as in reality, they're assessing part of themselves. I think this was by Branscombe and 1994. So in other words, what I just described, or what the original researchers just described, is what we call in-group favoritism. And according to the research, it can be affected by the in-group, our society, being negatively evaluated by external audiences, what we call the other. And therefore, foreign audiences must agree that the image is positive, that what we believe about us must be reflected in the opinion of the other. Otherwise, according to Browning, the group's symbolic existence is at risk because non-recognition can lead to the group either trying even harder to obtain approval or experiencing an identity crisis. And in my opinion, this theory is confirmed in the South Korean context, where non-recognition has led to repeated nation branding strategies and more money being invested and more policies being put into place to achieve the desired global status. But how do the media connect to all of these things? So first of all, media influences how we view ourselves and how we understand our community, whether we like it or not. It's one of the biggest influences that we have when forming our national identity. And the way events are presented to us is called framing, and it's designed by people, so it can hardly ever be objective. And even the selection of news or the order in which the news are presented to us is subjective. Journalists are members of the group, but they're also supposed to present the truth. So there is this constant clash between their patriotic sentiments and the principles that they have to follow as a journalist. So again, according to the research and the literature, journalists tend to favor their nation in case of when there is a perceived threat or conflict. And this phenomenon is called patriotic journalism. Now, when we talk about a conflict, it doesn't have to be a war or something like that, an armed conflict. It can be in a more metaphorical sense, such as a competition in which our nation, the us, tries to win over the other. And when our national team wins, we tend to feel proud as a nation, and it increases our collective self-esteem, especially if it's important to us, the specific match, if it's against an other that we have been taught that is our eternal like enemy or something like that. And the same thing is, of course, true for Korea as is for every other country, but even more so when Korea is hosting the events that we're describing. For example, when it hosted, I think it was the 2002 FIFA World Cup, journalists kept reminding people that the world has its eyes on us. That's the expression that they used. And they encouraged people to dress in a certain way, usually in red, because that's the color of the Korean national team, and to paint the teguki, the South Korean flag, on their face, and gather in large numbers in specific places. So not so coincidentally, the government at that point had created a branding strategy called Dynamic Korea. And whether people knew it and whether journalists were like aware of it or not, they did live the brand at that point. They supported it. They gathered in squares. They cheered for the team. They dressed up with their faces painted. And you know, this happens everywhere in the world. This is not just a Korean phenomenon. Like, you will walk in any country during a match, you will see people supporting their team. But not every government is as coordinated as the Korean government. And this is a very interesting thing about this research, how good of a job they're done with their branding strategies. However, there is this other case where, you know, the national reputation can actually be at risk. The examples here are flight crashes, like the Korean Air flight number 801 crash, and the Asian Airlines flight number 214 crash. The media, the US media, reported it was a pilot error. The Korean media reported it was a mechanical error because the pilots were Koreans. And by harming the reputation of the unit, the reputation of the collective would be a risk. So in those cases, the national interest has been characterized as a key component that influenced the framing of the news. Now, a medical emergency can be an even greater conflict in quotation marks, and even a greater risk. And for South Korea, this is especially important because of the negative experience the country had with MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. And many people have not even heard of it. They're not aware of its existence. It's another type of coronavirus. But for Korea, it's very important because compared to other countries, Korea had a higher toll. And this was one of the reasons, if not the top reason, that consecutive governments in Korea had already established a system to deal with such a situation. That is why Korea was prepared. Because, of course, theoretically, every government wants to protect the people, but practically, it was a huge reputation risk for the country. So, apologies. For the million-dollar question, how did the media frame the situation that we've all been going through this past couple of years when it comes to Korea? So, you know, foreign press, I'm sure you've come across it, like it's impossible to avoid it. I even saw it like 2 days ago. Foreign press is full of lessons from South Korea and South Korea's success and how did they do it? And comparisons with like other countries where people don't want to go get vaccinated. So arguably they've implemented a great system and there has been a lot of international praise. But, you know, at first it's not really obvious to us because many people don't read South Korean press. they were very, very critical of the government. And I think that is the norm in many countries. But but then slightly they started to change their narrative. And there is another study by Zhou and Tang. It's a 2020 study. And they did a framing analysis of 11 South Korean newspaper headlines. Those were in Korean. They didn't do the English language like this research did. And they wanted to see how did the media in South Korea portray the virus? What did the correlation with the international comparisons? Because they also noticed the praise from the international press, and how and why, and did the way the press report play a role in the government's approval ratings. And among their findings are example, of course, of the praise that South Korea received, but most interestingly, the explanation of how the media framing changed because of the external praise. How Korean media saw that other countries were praising them, and they changed their narrative because they felt proud. And all of these praise from the internal media, according to Zhou and Tang, led to the governing party winning the 2020 elections in the country. But there are two divergences to exclusion from what we have established as the collective, as of the us in South Korea, and there are also two divergences from the reporting of the press. First, there is the Shincheonji Church of Jesus religious group, which has been characterized as a sect, and that is very important. At some point, it was responsible for a cluster of infections in the city of Daegu, if I'm not mistaken. And the second one was a South Korean LGBT community. So around June 2020, there was a new cluster of cases in the area of Itaewon in Seoul, and it was linked to a gay club. Now, as a result, there was like a lot of press coverage, as well as a lot of homophobic reactions related to the latest one. Both cases were inside Korea, but they're about groups that don't necessarily belong to the collective us group that we established and examined. Shincheonji is a religious sect, even for like hardcore Christians of South Korea, and there's like a bunch of them. Shincheonji is like, no, you cannot sit with us, you cannot play with us. And unfortunately, the LGBT community is rather marginalized. So these are the only two divergences that I could find on negative reporting, even after the framing had changed. But now to my favorite part, which is the numbers of the research. So surprisingly to me, they found a lot of neutral articles, which I was really surprised by, but I cannot lie. But the interesting thing is that first we can see that from January to March in Dungang Daily, there are more negative articles than positive. But then the positives are slightly increased. The drops in May and June, I think we can consider them as the cases spiking, especially because of the Itaewon thing. And the same is true for the Korea Herald as well. There's a lot of neutral articles, but excluding those, we can see that up to March again, there are more negative, and then the positive are slightly gaining ground. But these two slides just depict the pure numbers. This is the sentiment analysis, how the sentiment was expressed by the headlines. So starting from January, there is a slight increase up to April that it picks, and then it kind of goes down in May, but it is still positive because the foreign press is still reporting positively. And the same, a similar curve is also true for the Korea Herald. The sentiment starts pretty low, and then it increases. So the Korea Herald published in total 984 negative and 907 positive articles. And the Dungang Daily published 531 negative and 499 positive articles. And In both cases, unfortunately for my hypothesis, the total of negative articles surpassed the total of positive articles. But as we saw by examining the result, by examining the results per month, there is a clear shift in sentiment in both outlets. A possible explanation for the shift in framing and sentiment could be the external recognition of the K quarantine system, as we established before and as Joe and Tang supported. But unfortunately for this research, further confirmation is not possible. The framing analysis was based on the headlines collected and not on the content of the articles, so it was rather limited. Therefore, I personally cannot conclude that the framing did indeed shift because of the reasons supported in Joe and Tang or in this research. But I can also not disagree with it. Like I'm somewhere in the middle. Like I can neither prove nor disprove. But by comparing the numerical sentiment and the theory and events described, there could be similarities among the reporting and framing by journalists, especially when we are considering the patriotic journalism narrative that we explained before, as well as the perceived reputation risk for the country. Now, the original hypothesis was that during the first 6 months of the outbreak, the English language South Korean media published more articles that affected the country in a favorable way than articles that negatively depicted the country to present a positive image of the country to the South Korean public and raise the national collective self-esteem. And if we chop that down into parts to make it like a bit easier to analyze, we have 3 parts: the number of the articles, the wish to present a positive image within the country, and the need to raise the national collective self-esteem. Now, from a purely numerical standpoint, the hypothesis does not hold. It was disproved by the results of the study, as the total number of positive articles was lower than the total number of negative ones. But, luckily for me, the numerical part holds for April, May, and June, because we saw that negative articles went down, positive articles increased. The argument regarding the journalist's wish to present a positive image of the country does have supporting evidence derived from comparison and analysis of previous studies in South Korean press framing, of international news that affect South Korea, such as the airplane crash. And it is also supported by the effect that the media are perceived to have on the nation brand. And finally, the need to raise the national collective self-esteem is also supported by previous literature. But as every research, there were certain limitations that I could not avoid. First of all, Vader is created exclusively for the English language. And although the outlets I use are in English, South Korean newspapers are known for making their own distinct use of the language, such as using loaded words and headlines that have expressions like "no dilly-dallying" or "getting schooled." And such factors can hinder computation and alter Vader's results. I think that would hold true even for the most advanced sentiment analysis software. Like, I don't think there is any sentiment analysis software that can understand what "no dilly-dallying" is. Second, there is an imbalance between the number of the articles from each newspaper. It was rather obvious in the end. Even though the same keyword was used in both outlets, the Korea Herald returned way more results than the Korea Jungang Daily. The word was not just detected on the headline, but also in the main body of the text of the article. So what I can think of, like why that happened, is that maybe Jungang Daily used other keywords, or that the Korea Herald search engine was, engineered in a way that it returns related results, like I searched for COVID and results for coronavirus come up as well. In any case, analyzing like every article that I found, every headline that I found, seemed to me like a better idea than chopping out some to try and balance the numbers of the articles, because that would have been quite random. And lastly, Vader is quite accurate. He has proven to be quite accurate by other researchers as well, but it's still a list of words and numbers. So proper examination of the material by human coders could help achieve a more accurate result. For the end, So this is the article that changed my life, the last one. Browning Christopher, 2015, Nation Branding and National Self-Esteem and the Constitution of Subjectivity in Late Modernity. It's a heavy read, but it's really great if someone is interested in the topic. And the other one is this one by Fan for 2008, Key Perspectives in Nation Image and a Conceptual Framework for Nation Branding. I think this is all that I wanted to show. Oh yes, and the template is not by me obviously or by Windows, it's by Slide Carnival, and we give them credit. And that's it. Thank you. Oh, thanks. So I'm gonna stop sharing now. And great. Maybe we can have a teeny tiny Q&A in case anyone has any remarks. No? Yes.
All right. First of all, thank you very much, Erin, for that really, really interesting presentation. I mean, I knew about your topic before, but this was really, really something really inspiring with regard to my dissertational topic as well.
Okay.
So I think we'll have a lot to talk in the future as well. For now, I'll just start, let's say, on like ground level with methodology. The article imbalance you addressed towards the end, that like you kind of hinted at it anyways. That could be helped by just trying and including more keywords, no?
For Tungang Daily, maybe that is the truth. But when trying to gather the materials, the truth is that I didn't just search and manually took every other headline. I used scraping. So I cannot promise that the code was perfect because it's not my job. But yes, for having more accurate results, maybe I should have gone, or more results, I should have gone with either additional keywords or with devoting like months to go through like one by one all of the pages and getting the results.
I mean, I don't know about you should have, like any project just has its natural limitations with your capacity. So, okay, but yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? Don't be shy. Feedback is good. Like maybe you didn't like something, that's also acceptable.
I mean, I have a bunch of questions.
Go ahead.
That has been the case in the past, but like I don't want to hog like the spotlight, if you will. So anyone else just chime in. For now, still more ground level. How sure is it that the positive press regarding COVID measures led to the electoral victory of the governing party? Like, is there a broad consensus on that? Is it very, very obvious, or?
Well, according to Joe and Tang, it was kind of the key factor, because at first the media were very, very skeptical and very critical, and there were headlines such as "Let's not have another MERS." But seeing how much influence the media have in our lives and how they can actually create all of these ideas that we get to have about our governments and about our society, I would say that the switch in the presentation was a key factor in seeing how the elections turned out, because it's my own personal belief that if you keep seeing around you people judging the government and saying, oh look, they're not doing a good job, we have this many dead people, this many sick people, our government is not establishing this, we're having another national tragedy with people dying, then of course people are going to be negatively affected. But if you see both the foreign press and the local press being like, look, we are doing great, and people are seeing that we're doing great, it does create a difference in the way that you think about yourself and about your government that is that is actually establishing the rules.
Yeah. All right. Okay.
But all of these, all of these need, like, I think that they will forever be on a theoretical level. I don't think there's anyone ever that's going to be, I can 100% prove that that was it.
Sure. All right. Okay. More towards like the theoretical woodwork, political theoretical woodwork. You said something more towards the beginning, and I'm not sure if I caught it right. You either said a collective self is necessary for a nation or for a society to survive in some way. So either way, like, would you say this is like at this, you know, for the survival as the society as in a collective, or for a state, not just as in institutions, but for a certain state of affairs, as in a hegemony of a certain group or certain groups?
I would say that having a common identity is not just, you know, I don't want to end up in the nation state theory, but I kind of am, because that is the leading factor and like the leading form of organization that we have in our societies right now. But I think that having a common sense of identity, even if there are minorities within the group, is what has been keeping the countries alive, and it is the predominant model that we're seeing in our nations, in our countries. To be completely honest, I don't think that right now like if there is no sense of a common identity, either social or national identity, I think that there is really no way for a country to keep having the same institutions that we have established now in the same flow in function. Yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question.
So no, that's exactly what I'm getting at. And like, I would tend to agree, but at the same time, isn't like such a nation branding project or anything similar. Like, you know, you had those examples of like football or like soccer world championships, like any international game. Isn't it always also a project of a hegemonic project that also excludes the internal other? Like, you have that very interesting, or those very interesting examples of that a religious minority and LGBTQI people, you know. So like, isn't a you know, people that diverge from the sort of archetype of South Korean nationals that are like pursued in these branding efforts, always also sort of excluded?
I think it really depends on the coexistence of the majority and the minorities, because there are other minorities within South Korea that were not they're not really accepted, but were not blamed. Exactly. So one thing I can think of is foreigners within South Korea. Of course, there is this whole discourse about, oh, you know, no foreigners because of the virus. Foreigners need to be extra careful, but the hate was not that extreme as it was in the case of the LGBT community, where people lost their jobs just because they were gay.
Okay. So much for cancel culture.
Yes, it really has to do with how much people are accepted, how the majority accepts the minority, and if the minority and the majority get along nicely, then there are no such issues. But
okay.
I believe that at some point you really need someone to blame.
Scapegoat. Okay.
Now is your chance. He's thinking of his next question. Anyone?
Yeah, go ahead and take it. I'm happy to wait.
No one. Okay.
That happens.
It happens. It was such an amazing presentation. Like I explained everything so nicely.
No, I don't like. I think you just provided a lot of information. It's a lot to digest.
I was like, looking at it. It was 113 pages.
There you go. And I think not everyone is like has their interests lined up as nicely as I have with your topic. And this next one is really going towards that direction. Would you say that the national brand fills a gap in the self-perception of individuals and their place in the world that might have been left by the waning influence of traditional cultural identities and religion, in the sense of a search for their own life's meaning?
I would like you to repeat that, please.
All right. So like the national brand, or just like the national identity in general, how it's like pursued in a like more and more modern and updated way. Mm-hmm. Does it address a gap that maybe results from the waning of traditional cultural identities and also religion?
I don't think that the shift in identity and how people perceive their country addresses any sort of gap. I think that people are just like, okay, we're disagreeing, but above all, we're agreeing that we belong to the same nation. Our understanding of the nation is rather different, and we're going to leave it at that. I remember I had an interaction with a Korean friend of mine while I lived there, and she told me she was trying to rent an apartment, and the landlords, they were an old couple who told her, our president is taking money from us and they're giving it to you. That was the comment, which was, you know, you can see how people have a different understanding of the reality and of their experiences, how the same rules apply to each other. Now on the topic of religion, I know I talked about, first of all, the hardcore Christians that exist in Korea, and about the religious, sect. But the truth is that the majority of Koreans are not religious at all. They're not Buddhists, they're not Christians, and even if they are, religion does not play that much of a role. I think it's approximately like 40% of the people who belong to an organized religion in Korea. So it's not the majority of the country, it's just that the religious group is very vocal. Especially when the government is trying to introduce an anti-discrimination bill, and it tries to include the LGBT minority. That's when the Christian Koreans become very, very vocal.
Okay.
And again, that's a certain part. Like, I don't want to group them all together. You know, that's the biggest group that opposes the anti-discrimination bill.
Yeah, but I mean, you could certainly draw the parallel to like other societies, like the Westboro Baptist Church in the States, or like just the Catholic Church anywhere. So yeah, and like many other, religions. Like, yeah. Okay. Well, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome. Nothing else? Right. I don't know. Was it that bad?
No, it was. I'm pretty sure it was just that good. Actually.
Okay.
Like great. That's my impression.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So if there is like nothing else from anyone, I will stop the recording here. Thank you very much for coming.